That's going to be a...
All right, we'll go ahead and get started tonight. Everyone doing all right? So tonight we're going to continue our series that I was doing with the kids these last couple weeks. Last week we talked about the Bible, why it was a credible source, looking at the historical evidence behind it, the accuracy behind it, using evidence and eyewitness accounts to really understand why we believe that the Bible is a credible source of information. And this week we're going to build on top of that. And so to this week we're going to talk about, if this will work. Come on now. Hello. Why are you... Nope, there we are. Guess it was being delayed or whatever. Cool. So this week we're working on the character of God. So we're looking at this story. We've established the Bible as a credible source. So now people who start reading the Bible are going to have serious questions about God's character, what He's like, who He is. But for this week specifically, we're going to get a little bit more philosophical about some of our ideas because, again, we have to think almost worldly and rationally about the concepts and ideas that they're going to be looking at when they're looking at this, because we can't think of it from the perspective that we like to. As Christians, we have this an idea in our heads that we're building a relationship with God. We make it personal. We learn as much as we can about Him, and we love Him for all the things that He's done for us and who He is. But people who are just now starting to understand what that means and what all that is, they don't have that yet. So we have to kind of shift our focus out of really knowing who God is and looking at almost a secular view of what God should be. And so first we ask, who is this being we call God? What would God, calling a being God, look like? And so we have what we call the perfect being theology. And this perfect being theology states that it is a being with which nothing greater can be conceived or is possible. It also includes having the best array of possible great-making properties. Now, what does all that mean? Well, first, a being with nothing greater can be conceived or possible. They add conceived and possible because we're trying to conceive who God is, but we're human, our imaginations are limited, so we also have to remember it's beyond what we can conceive, it's what's possible in the universe that we exist in. And then having the best array of compossible great-making properties. Compossible simply means capable of being had all together at the same time, while great-making properties simply means a property that is intrinsically better to have than to lack. We're going to use a lot of kind of philosophical language tonight, like properties, compossible great-making properties. We're also going to include words like accidental and essential properties. Now, an accidental property is a property that something, whether it's God or anything that you're talking about in philosophy, could exist without. But in this case, it does. So it's almost accidental that it does, if you want to think of it that way. And essential means that by its existence, it is essential that it has that property. And so in this context of perfect being theology, it brings up 7 properties that are considered essential for a being to be considered God. We have conscious, free, benevolent, knowledgeable, powerful, creative, and necessarily existing. Now we'll go into detail with most of these, not all of them, because I don't have a whole hour to do that with as much as I would love to do that. But we can't do that tonight, unfortunately. So first let's start with consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious? Well, the Oxford Dictionary gives awake, aware, and able to respond to one's surroundings. So first question I have for you guys tonight, why is it better that God is a conscious God, not just some unconscious force of nature?
Knows where we're at, knows what we're going to. He's aware of our individual and group situations.
It feeds into that knowledge, like His ability to know us, to know things that are going on, and not just a chaotic force.
It makes him more personal.
Makes him more personal. It makes him a person. It doesn't just make him some, like a gust of wind. It makes him something real.
If he desires, he can modify it.
He has will. He has choices. It doesn't just make him a person, but it makes him someone with free will, something that we can relate to. And it's important because that will come up in a second of why God has free will. So we compare that to the Bible and we're thinking, well, how do we know that God is conscious? Or specifically, when do we see that he's being conscious? And so, there's several different examples in the Bible, specifically in the Old Testament. There's only like 2 specific examples in the New Testament besides Jesus himself, where God is shown to have conversations with people. But I think one of the most telling conversations he has is in Exodus chapter 3, the burning bush. In this conversation he has with Moses, he responds to Moses, one of the first aspects of being conscious. Moses is asking questions, making statements, and God is responding to those. It's not just like a recording of a phone call. It's like he is being there. God identifies himself. He consciously knows who he is. Presents new information. It's not just, he only knows how to do certain things, and he's very limited. He can present new information that Moses didn't know, that no one knew, and shows emotion. Again, kind of making him more personal, going to show his personality, his free will, and his choices.
I don't know if we have time for questions, but
Sure.
So why, from a philosophical standpoint, does, by definition, God need to be conscious?
Well, from a philosophical standpoint, especially when you look at the viewpoint of God being a creator God, so these essential properties are better to have than to lack. So in this case, that's all the definition we have behind that. So it is better for him, at least it is considered better for him to be conscious than unconscious for the reasons that we talked about, for him to make choices. Yeah. And again, that kind of feeds into this next slide of being free or having free will, is another way of saying that. So what does it mean to be free? And philosophically, they define it as to be able to make choices or decisions without influence or force. So, for instance, if you're at a voting booth and you're trying to vote on, let's say, the next president, and let's say it looks like you have a choice, A and B, but then you click on whichever one you want, and the only answer that ever comes out is A. So you never really have a choice, and you unconsciously know that in this case. But God being conscious, he would know of his choices. But if you ever try to pick an option and only one option ever comes out, you're not having that free choice. You don't have that free will. So then I ask, why is it important that God is free?
I think if he's not free, it says that something is more powerful than him that makes him not free.
Right, then something controls his decision making.
By definition, God has to be all powerful.
Nothing can control him. Anything else? You have another thing? So part of that is he also knows, being what free will is, it's good that he can bestow that upon us. So then we can have conversations about, well, do we have free will? Well, first of all, we have to have the ability to have free will. So our Creator had to know what free will is to give it to us. So him himself having free will allows him to be able to know what that is, understand it, and so that he can bestow that upon us. That also makes him what we call a true moral agent. And what that means is he has the true ability to know the moral rights and wrongs behind certain decisions and is able to make those decisions. It is one thing to know the difference between those decisions, but it also is the difference between being able to make the decisions but not knowing which one's right or wrong. So in this case, God being who God is, it is better for him to be free so that he can become the true moral agent, and in this case, the determining factor behind what is righteous and what is unrighteous. And so again, where do we see him being free in the Bible? Well, this sounds a little weird because a lot of times we read these stories and his mind's almost already made up. He has all the information, he has all the cards in his hand when he's talking to people, and so it sounds weird to think of him making choices or changing his mind. But I did find at least 2 examples in this case. When we look at Genesis 18 and Exodus 32, Abraham pleads for Sodom and Gomorrah. That's the story of, well, if there's 50 people, spare them. Or if there's, I think, 25 and 10 and 1. If there's one righteous person, spare Sodom and Gomorrah. And so that was Abraham whittling him down in a way, but, changing God's mind because he asked him to. And then same thing with Moses. At that point in Exodus 32 was when they had just made the golden calf, and they were worshiping it while Moses was on the mountain talking to God, getting the 10 Commandments. And so at that point, God goes, well, hey, they're doing this great sin against me. I'm about to go destroy them and set my wrath upon them. And Moses, being Moses, goes, Lord, please don't do that. We are your chosen people. We're the one you're going to make nations out of. Don't do this, please. And so with that, God spares them. So in those cases, God makes choices. And it's not necessarily right or wrong in this case because either choice would be considered righteous for God. But we do see that he can make conscious decisions, that he can have choices and can change his mind. Which kind of goes in hand with being a conscious being. So I'm not going to go that in depth with every single one of these. I don't have enough time for that, unfortunately. But we're going to blow through a couple of these really quickly. So benevolent, we know that it's better to be benevolent than not because a wrathful, vengeful God would eventually probably destroy his creation, and so we would no longer be here. So that would not be better to have. It would be better to lack in that case. But being benevolent, we see that through, obviously, the grace and the cross. Our biggest reason why we're Christians is because Christ died on the cross for our sins. But also a really cool example is the book of Judges. When you look at over and over again how Israelites fall away from God and then God brings them back with a judge, and then they fall away and God brings them back. And it's very benevolent in the sense of, forgiveness. Over and over and over again they mess up, and yet he continues to bring them back because he loves them. Knowledgeable. Well, we kind of covered this a little bit last week with prophecy. He's extremely, extremely knowledgeable and smart, which of course he should be if he's the creator God who made everything. He should know those things that he made well. But he's so smart that he can see into the future what's going to happen, and he knows us so well that he can give us those words of prophecy. And even things like Jesus, knowing things no human should know, showing his divinity as well. One of my favorite examples of that is when he's talking to Peter and he says, you're going to deny me 3 times before, I think it was a rooster crows. And so things like God is very well knowledgeable to the point of knowing the future because of how much he understands beyond what we could comprehend. Powerful. Well, yeah, he should be powerful. That'd be great. And how do we know that? Well, causes the plagues of Egypt is a good example of his power over the physical world. Able to raise the dead is a good example of his power over the spiritual world. And then, of course, being the creator of the universe, that helps, But yes, anything more powerful than God would no longer make him God. That whatever is more powerful than him would be considered God. And then finally, creative. Well, I think this one is a little bit more self-evident. We can see nature around us. We can see our own human bodies and how intricate and creative those are. And not just our physical makeup, but our emotions, the way that we think, our ideas. Some of us being smart and some of us being creative. Some of us being left-handed versus right-handed, tall versus short. All these different things. He made us different on purpose, and it's very creative in all the different ideas that we can create in nature, all the different versions of beauty that exist. And so it's better that he was creative than not creative because all those differences allow, granted, for some negative effects, but also the fellowship we have with each other in those differences makes it, I think, better to fill the gaps in for each other. And finally, the last one that we're going to cover that I think is a little bit more important than the rest is necessarily existent. And so what do I mean by that? It is defined as not contingent nor dependent on anything else to exist. So again, if he depended on something else, he wouldn't be God. But how could we possibly prove this? How could we imagine, understanding what that means? Well, the first thing we read in the Bible, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, is all the evidence we should need for this. And what I mean by that is we can break this up into three sections. In the beginning, God. It's not in the beginning God was born or God was created. It's not in the beginning of God. It is in the beginning, comma, God. So in that sentence structure, there is a assumption that God already exists. So in this case, God existed before time. So he cannot be dependent on it if he existed before it. So then in the next phrase, God created the heavens. Well, he's not talking about heaven that we like to think about. He says heavens. And even in the Greek, this is mostly used. Yeah, okay. Sorry. In the Greek, this is used to describe space, outer space, where the stars, the sun, the other planets exist. And so a lot of times we think of, he created the universe. Well, in that universe is a 3D space. And so, we like to use the word space to define both, but he existed before space. Before him, there was no space. There was no 3D anything. It was just void and nothingness. And then in that space allows, something to exist in it, which is matter. And in our case, God created the earth. And so a lot of times people could think, well, if he created the heavens, being the stars and the 3D space, he may have created matter before that with other planets. Well, that could be true, but that would only reinforce the point of he existed before matter. And we like to define earth as, well, obviously being made of matter, so if he created the earth, he created matter. So he's not dependent on time, space, or matter, which scientists always say everything in our universe is defined by. And if you want Trinity of Trinities, it's kind of cool. Time is defined as past, present, future. Space is, X, Y, Z. Shoot, I can't think of it. Not up, down, left, right. There you go. Height, length, width. I don't know why I blanked out on that one, sorry. And matter, liquid, gas, solids. So Trinity of Trinities. I thought that's kind of cool. But now we have another problem that comes up. A problem that kind of blends the ideas of his free will, but also his benevolence. And that is the problem of evil. Now, who has heard of the problem of evil before? The phrase specifically. So, you probably have heard of it if you don't think you have. But you've probably heard it in some form or fashion this. Why would an omnipotent or all-powerful God allow evil to exist? Why would an omnibenevolent or an all-good God allow good people to die or suffer? Why would God allow evil to win? And if God is all good, he cannot be all-powerful. That is a statement that is used in various, usually literature. I've had conversations with people that specifically have said that to me. And it's really, to me it's odd, but they have this line of thinking that comes with, I'm skipping ahead on my own point. But first, let's describe why would God allow evil to exist? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Free will. He wants us to have free will. He wants us the ability first to choose him. So in choosing him, we have a relationship with him. It's about true love. It's about having a true relationship. If I created a little robot, and that robot's only job was to love me, to hug me, to do things for me, and that was it, that's all it ever knew, that wasn't true love. That's not a true relationship. That's just all it's ever known. But if it had the ability to say, well, I want to do something else, or I could stay here with you and help you and love you, and then it chooses to love me, that's a choice. That's relationship. That's love. And so in this case, he wanted us to have a choice to be able to choose him. But unfortunately, with that ability to choose good is also the ability to choose bad. And so many people fall into that trap of that immediate satisfaction here on earth of choosing evil because it feels good, because it helps you, because you gain something here on earth. And then it also creates this sense of responsibility. When we have a choice, we're responsible for that choice. We're responsible for the actions of that choice. And in this case, responsible for our sin, or responsible for the relationship that we have with Him if we choose Him. And a lot of times people will say, well, we could choose Him, but what if He doesn't choose us? But when reading the text, we already know, especially through giving up His Son on the cross, He gave us the gift of salvation. He's already reaching out His hand to shake your hand and pull you closer in. It's your choice. The ball's in your court to grab that hand and go closer, or to slap it away, throw away that gift of salvation on your own. Yes?
Did we already gave us the gift of salvation, or He?
I'm sorry?
On your deal up there, on the far right.
Oh, that's He already gave us. Sorry. Typo. He already gave us the gift of salvation, but it is up to us to accept or throw away.
I thought that's what you meant.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Well, how did that happen? Well, there's my animations that was supposed to happen. Oops. Anyway. Well, you also have to look at, why would God allow evil to win in this case? Well, we have to look at God's priorities. What is God looking at? What does God want for us? And again, we're looking at this as God as a true moral agent, because it is better for Him to have free will and be benevolent and conscious than to not be. And so when we look at God's priorities, we say, well, God cares more about your eternity than the short life here on earth. So the way I like to think about it is, say someone was going to give you $1 million, but then you had $20 in your wallet that got stolen. Are you going to let that $20 you just lost ruin your whole day? No. You're going to be excited that you got that $1 million. Or at least you should be excited that you got that $1 million. That's going to more than make up for the $20 you just lost. So God cares more about the eternity, the infinite lifetime we're going to spend with Him in heaven, than the $20, 20 seconds that we live here on earth. But a lot of people don't see it that way. They have to get past that boundary of, only looking at life here on earth. Because for them, they say, well, evil wins all the time. People get away with murder. People get away with this and embezzling and all this and that. And we say, well, sure, they may win here on earth, quote unquote, but they'll lose when that earth passes away. When they go to that grave without all that money that they tried taking with them.
Yeah, if God is omnipotent, and if He's benevolent, and if He's just, nobody gets away with anything. Period.
This last week, the students really had this interest in hell and Hades and all these different versions that the Bible talks about, including some revelations. And so when I was looking at it, there's a story of a beggar named Lazarus and the rich man. And some of you are familiar with this. The rich man, has all he wants. He flaunts his wealth. He's happy. He's enjoying his life. And Lazarus, the beggar, has sores all over him. Even dogs are licking his wounds to help him. He's got nothing, and he's always constantly suffering. And then the perspective changes after both men die, and Lazarus is next to Abraham in paradise, while the rich man is burning in hell. And the rich man goes, "Can you reach out your hand and simply, give me a drop of water for my thirst as I'm in agony in this fire?" And so that's right. As a perfect, just God, it may seem that life on here on earth could be unfair and unjust, and evil can sometimes win, but they will get their just dues in time. They will get their reward, or in fact, they already have gotten their reward if they win here on earth, and that's all they're going to get. But for us, we know what's to come. We know what's better. God's glory shines brightest in suffering, as we still have fellowship together in hope of eternity. Suffering no longer matters. I say this especially inspired by when we were just looking at The Chosen. Little James, right, was the one who had the spinal problem, and he couldn't walk correctly, and he was always in pain. And Jesus purposely chose not to heal him, but instead gave him the ability to heal others. And so constantly he's saying, well, why would you do this to me? I'm in constant pain. I want to be healed. Why would you just let me sit here in pain? And Jesus goes, well, think about the story that you have. Despite all that pain, despite what you're going through, the joy that you have, the joy that you can show others, and the relief that you can give to others through first of all, the good news of Jesus Christ, but also in his ability to heal. If all of that is what makes him happy and keeps him going, and he's not distracted by the pain of his body, and he's not depressed or angry by what's going on to his physical body, then how much more will people see that and go, wow, maybe this physical body doesn't really matter that much. Maybe this suffering that I do here on earth is really just a short-term pain that we can get through to find something so much better, to get to something so much better. And so a lot of times, even though we suffer here on earth, God's glory can shine through that because we have a joy that is complete and fellowship with each other. And then, of course, a lot of people here on earth like to think of physical death as suffering or as a punishment. But God sees it as peace, as eternal peace and comfort living with him. And so it's almost like, I don't know, the example I thought of was a child coming back home from daycare. Like the parent wants the break, to send them to childcare all day while they're working, but they still miss the child. They love their child. And so when that child comes home, they're excited, and the child's glad to be there to see the mom and dad, and the parents hug them and love them and are glad to see their child again. And so this physical death seems like suffering to people who only focus on the life here. But for us, it's coming home. For us, it's seeing our Father who we haven't seen in a long time. And for us, that's peace, that's love, that's much more than we could ever hope for here. So we have to help people who are looking at this shift their perspective on life here and life to come. So then, how can God be all powerful and all good? A lot of times, they have this line of logic. Here was jumping my head on myself. If God is necessarily good, if he is essentially good, then God cannot do evil. If God cannot do evil, then he isn't omnipotent or all-powerful. So, if God is all good, then he is not all-powerful. Which, if we look at this, first of all, then God cannot do evil. It limits God. It limits his choices. And we said, philosophically, it's better for him to be free. And then, of course, it's better for him to be all-powerful. So then how do we reconcile the two? Well, we say his ability, or his apparent inability, to not do evil comes from his morally perfect being, or being a true moral agent, not from his lack of power. God has the ability to do evil if he chose to. God has the power to do anything. But being a perfectly moral agent, being that perfectly moral being, I say prevents him to. He chooses not to. And so all this argument really does is highlight how perfect moral being he is. How he can consistently choose righteous actions, to choose love, to choose forgiveness, despite his abilities, his powerful and unrestricted abilities to do other things. Oop. What's going on with this transition? Okay, well, I don't know what's going on. So then we have, this concept of Old versus New Testament God. A lot of people like to point this out and say, well, it's two different versions of God. The first Old Testament is some wrathful, vengeful God that unjustly punishes the world, only holds that select few Israelites as holy and values them, and everyone else is excluded from his love. And then we have this New Testament version of God that is all loving, who accepts everyone as they are, forgives everyone for everything they've ever done, and kind of the opposite, is a controlling goody two-shoes who wants us to always follow the rules or burn in hell for all eternity. His way or the highway type thing. Now, at Summer Assignment, we like to call these things false narratives. It's looking at information and saying something that, while at first glance sounds true, isn't really what's going on if you really take an in-depth look at what's happening. And so when we look at it, we look at this true narrative behind God.
Yeah, those statements are neither sound nor valid.
Exactly. In the Old Testament, it's actually more of a father actively guiding and disciplining a child. When we look at God, we see a father who created the universe, and repeatedly the people that he chose were, rebuking him, rejecting him, failing him over and over again. And this was his way of actively trying to guide them towards his plan, and disciplining them when it came time to, because of the sin that was in the world. Taking an example for Noah, he chose Noah because of his righteousness, and the rest of the world was drowned in a flood because of their sinfulness. And then we look at the New Testament, and this is them giving them the truth, and allowing them to make their own choices. Now, one example of this, and I'm inspired by this because of Elijah, honestly. When you give your kids the car for the first time, when they're driving and they turn 16, right? In this case, it's, now they have the ability to choose and have that freedom. What are they going to do with it? How are they going to make their own choices? Well, God gives us the truth in physical form of Jesus Christ, and then allows us to make our own choices. Instead of punishing us constantly for making mistakes, he says, if you come back, if you repent, if you try to choose me, if you try to know me and have a relationship with me, I will forgive you. I want you to come back to me. I want you to be a part of the family with me. And so this is what we call the true narrative behind God's character in each version of those. Does anyone have any more questions?
No, I have a comment. I'm anxious to hear what Lynn has to say about Romans chapter 9 in light of all that coming up. So if y'all are not coming to that, you need to.
That'll be the second Sunday of August.
God's sovereignty is also involved in all that.
I think you finally got around to answering my question.
Oh, that's good.
But you made probably at least the first half or three-quarters of your presentation insisting that God was free.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted you to reconcile that with the passage that says God cannot lie. So is he free to lie or not?
Which passage is that? Is that in Romans chapter 9 that he's talking about?
No, that has nothing to do with Romans. I can't tell you about offhand what the
I'll look it up.
Okay.
chapter
I should know where it is. But
So, in that slide that I talked about the problem with God's power with his morality, it says God cannot lie. But that is not in his lack of power. That is from his moral ability, from his righteousness and his choosing to constantly do good.
Which immediately leads me to the question, what defines his moral nature?
What defines his moral nature?
Yeah, when you say God has a moral nature, what standard is that being measured by?
Well, I don't know about standard, but when you look at these concepts of the different properties that we've been looking at that were supposedly essential to his character to be God, to be defined as God, we have free, so he has the ability to make choices, and then benevolent, to choose a better option, to choose the righteous option in those choices. So I don't know about...
But what defines the righteous option?
Well, I would point that towards God's knowledge. For his vast knowledge, he has the ability to know the consequences of different actions, whether they are righteous or unrighteous, and to know the difference between the two.
Is there any standard to define good behavior, righteous behavior, moral behavior that God is governed by?
I would say God governs righteous behavior. That for us, what we can do is we can look at his character and he is righteous by definition. And so the only standard that we could have, at least for our own character, is God and what he would do and what he does. But I think he himself is not limited to or defined by anything, because he cannot be limited by, he cannot depend on anything, but he can define it for us in his character.
You got where I wanted you to go.
Okay, good.
The nature of God is what defines morality.
Right.
It's what defines right and wrong. There is no higher power or no higher set of rules to tell us what is right or wrong other than what comports or matches the nature of God.
Mm-hmm.
Because without an ultimate judge, there is no right or wrong. The passages, by the way, are in Numbers 23:19 and Titus 1:2.
I'll have to look into that.
There are more. It's Hebrews 16:18 is probably the one we go to the most, that by two immutable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, that we might have strong consolation that fled for refuge and lay hold of the hope set before us. So,
I hope you know I'm not being argumentative with you. I appreciate everything you said.
Okay, good.
It was an excellent presentation. If you cover enough ground tonight, we could spend the next 5 years.
I know. I'll tell you what. I was also doing this with a discussion group of a bunch of kids for like 20 minutes. So we were flying through stuff.
even I believe, just for credit to where it goes, I think it's Dr. Ken Holbein is the one who recently talked about that Genesis thing. He may have gotten it from somewhere else. I don't know, but that's the first one I ever heard. Talked about the Trinity of Trinities, time, space, and matter.
Okay,
and
well,
those things.
I will admit I looked that up on a document. I don't know if they credited him with that information, but
Some people think it's crazy.
right.
I'm not, an issue that helped me through the years of trying to make sense out of all this. Does God have to react to human beings? Let me put it like this: if human beings have free will,
Mm-hmm.
then that would imply that we can make a wrong choice.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think?
And indeed.
And if we make a wrong choice, does that put God in the position of having to react to our wrong choice instead of just letting us do whatever we want to do with our free will without him saying, oh, well, let them do whatever they want to?
I would think God uses the Holy Spirit in our hearts and in the hearts around us, the people around us, to hopefully try to influence us to bring us back if we were stepping away from Him in a wrongful choice. However, I think God wants us to choose Him, and so to choose Him is also the ability to choose wrong. And so while He may influence us with the Holy Spirit, He would ultimately respect our decision because He knows that He gave us the truth. He gave us the consequences of our actions, and so we have an informed decision on that. And so if He says, well, if you want to choose wrong, you know what's going to happen if you do. And He will in a way respect it. I don't know if that's the right word, but He will allow us to make that mistake.
So how would you deal with those? I'm going to go to Romans 9 anyway.
Sorry, do
How
it.
would you deal with those vessels that are prepared for destruction versus those vessels that are prepared for glory in light of that?
I'll have to study that to give you a more informed answer.
Given the rest of Christianity.
Fair enough. I will say, honestly, part of my answer kind of spoils what I want to talk about for next week.
Okay.
So I don't want to cover that quite yet. But I will say, the vessel, like what determines the vessels, is our own free will for eternal life or for destruction. And so that is still up to us. But anything beyond that, I think we'll dip into next week's topic. Before you continue, I think, Elijah, do you have another question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, what Lenny was talking about, we know, like, God is benevolent because He interceded and sent His Son down, rather than just letting us, bathe in our destructive tendencies and just sink in our sin. He loves us to the point that He wanted us to do better, and He wanted us to have an opportunity, like you talked about, to live in heaven with Him, to just be better off as people.
Right.
He's good. And He wants us to be good.
Indeed.
All I wanted to say is I don't remember if it was on Wednesday night or 9:45 on one of the Sunday mornings that I recently mentioned again, as have several times before, less of whether his little book, only less than 100 pages long, with 5 chapters. The first 3 chapters, the book is entitled The Will of God.
Mm-hmm.
And the first 3 chapters, he talks about God's intentional will, or maybe he calls it God's ideal will, which is that which was what God wanted, what was consistent with his nature. The second chapter is on God's circumstantial will, and that is when human beings have abused their free will and misbehaved horribly. We've got thousands, millions of historical examples of that. All of us really have seen. How does he react to that? That's not his ideal will.
Mm-hmm.
And so our behavior, because we have free will, puts us in a predicament of puts God in a predicament of having to respond to what we're doing wrong. And then the third chapter is God's ultimate will, and that's how God is fixing the problem, solving the problem through Jesus the Christ, providing salvation and grace that will be on his side and eliminating the rest of the problems.
Mm-hmm. I will also add, I know we're way over time, so I apologize to everyone already in advance for this. We can say it's London's fault.
I thought we went to like 15 anyway.
Yeah, it's fine. So this is not my own idea. This is something I saw on social media, so I don't know exactly where to credit it to. But I read something about using the difficulty, and that's an expression used in acting. And it was a case where something would happen unexpectedly in a scene for an actor, and they didn't know what to do with it, but instead they would just roll with it and use it as part of the scene and improvise. So God has an established will. He has what he wants to happen, but has to have the flexibility to allow us to have free will in that plan. And so in a case of someone choosing to do something wrong or evil, he would use that, I think, to help someone else. He would use that moment to help someone else define their choice, to allow them to understand his will and to progress his will further in other areas. With that specific person, it could be a friend who was struggling with faith, saw that friend walk away, and now they're having questions about something that they were dealing with, but now maybe have answers towards, or vice versa. If that person was choosing to come closer to Christ, and a friend saw that, then maybe they choose to come closer to Christ because their friend did. Whatever that may be, God uses our free will and our choices in response to what we do to further his will even more in other areas, in other ways, with other people.
It was Michael Caine.
Michael Caine? Okay. I think I remember that now.
Yeah, if it's a drama, pick it up and smash it. It's on somewhere. For those of you who want to Google it.
Yeah, I'm about to say, yeah, Google that, because that's something that he talks
It's a pretty
about.
neat thing.
It is really neat. But I think that's kind of goes along the lines of what God does. He responds by allowing our choices to further his will even more. That make sense? Any other questions?
Thank you.
Absolutely.